we're here to kind of talk about like why you're probably doing this right already. So first of all, I'm Nick Walker. I'm here because I love to give presentations, of course, and from the safety of my own home, it's even easier. But what I kind of want to focus on a little bit today is not just about some of the things that Rob and Jonathan have been talking about, but also how to develop you as a person. Like, we're all Agilists, and something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about the past couple of years as I've kind of got into more leadership positions and so on, is how to help all of you become much better at what you do. So you can find me at Nick Walker, and of course you can always stalk me on LinkedIn, but there you go. Now, the topic of agnostic agile and kind of why you're probably doing this all right already, like why does that even matter? Like, why are we talking about it? So I want to share with you some examples of things of why it probably does matter. So let's talk about jobs, first of all. Now, there is a bit of a silver lining, I think, sometimes to companies like mine that are fully remote and can recruit, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are currently looking for new work. So let's kind of imagine the scenario for a second that you're looking for a new Scrum Master job, and your interpretation of Scrum Master hits a certain criteria. But I was looking at LinkedIn today, and I came across a couple of job specs. The first one here, take a couple of first bullet points. Okay, cool, looks good, right? Responsibilities, yeah, okay. This is another one that I looked at. I pulled again a couple of them out. What I want to get you focused on is these two in particular. One, facilitate Scrum events to be purposeful, effective, encourage continuous improvement. Second one, responsibilities, all planning around effectiveness, repeatable sprinting for a long-running team, requirements, sprint planning, sprint ceremonies, quality, and deployment. And I appreciate, some of the wording in there is kind of whatever, but that essentially implies that you, as that Scrum Master, will be facilitating running those ceremonies. And I think for a lot of us, that would be pretty common, right? But if you look at scrum.org and you look at the official what a Scrum Master does and what it does for a development team, so this is kind of the text taken from the scrum.org website, the founders of Scrum. They talk about facilitating Scrum events as requested or needed. They don't say it's a mandatory thing. They don't say it's something that you should be doing, as requested or needed. I think it's a really important distinction to make, how, even something that is, specifically called out as a specific job role, such as Scrum Master, has such a different distinction in terms of what it is going to do and what it isn't going to do. And I think the reason why I'm kind of pointing this out to you all is because depending on your organization and the way that it defines what that job role is and what the job specification is, it can massively change kind of actually how that kind of affects your kind of customer impact and the way that you're working, your philosophy, that your values, just purely on something as simple as that. So let's kind of think about some of the questions of why that has an impact. What are the expectations? Is that hands-on role, hands-off role? Do you facilitate? Do you coach? Do you guide? Do you lead? Don't know. But what's actually important? Is it a process or an outcome? In neither of those first job specs did it talk about what the purpose or the why was. You're going to facilitate these ceremonies. Great. They're going to be wonderful ceremonies. And much like my kind of presentation fellows, saying very similar things. It's like, what's it actually about? Like, what is the kind of importance for this? Something that Ken Schwaber wrote, and I love this because it uses the word flaccid. Usually this would be the crowd, and as Rob said, you'd kind of hopefully gauge a bit of a reaction and a bit of a laugh. But there are many instances of flaccid Scrum teams where they're using the Scrum vocabulary but weren't able to create a potentially shippable increment or functionality within a single sprint. I think that's really, really important. I think that quote is lovely, not just because of the flaccid part, but because you've got a job spec where some of us will be going to apply for these jobs. You have organizations that say, we're going to attract this talent. We're going to have these people that are going to join us and they're going to do these things, but actually don't necessarily line up with the original intention of what it is. But it's also about what they don't say. Something kind of as part of doing this talk and, having done this for a long time now, people look at the, even the Agile Manifesto and, the millions of books and the, dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations that provide training and about how they do this. But a lot of it is about what they don't say. So I want to kind of shake some some perceptions maybe, and talk about Scrum and Spotify. So this is another thing, is like when I wrote this, I didn't kind of necessarily consider that I can't have people's hands up, so you have to kind of bear with me here. But on scrum.org, so this is Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland's website. So for those that don't know or aren't familiar with the names, they founded Scrum. They kind of came up with the idea of Scrum, and they make millions and millions of dollars kind of on this. But they've got a community forum. And I love this because I looked into it. It's something so simple. In the Scrum guide, it talks about the optimal development team being 3 to 9 members. I was talking to someone about this and they said it was 7 plus or minus 2. And then I replied, it's 3 to 9. And apparently I was wrong, because that's not what the guide says. The guide says it should be this, and I said this, and I was told that it's wrong. So what is the correct size for a team? And it kind of made me chuckle a little bit, because there's always that argument of like, why does it even matter? Like, why is someone having the conversation about what size team works and what size team doesn't by an arbitrary rule that doesn't have the context of the problem they're trying to solve? And again, thinking about those job specs for a second, it doesn't think about what the overall purpose is. Why do you need a team of plus or minus, like 7 plus or minus 2 in the first place? Is it because you're trying to do something really big? Is it because you're trying to meet a certain goal or an outcome? Like, who knows? It's not even part of the conversation. It's just an arbitrary rule because a guide says that you need to do this or you need to do that. Or, you know, Jeff Bezos says that you need to have, you know, teams that can be fed by, you know, no more than 2 pizzas. Like, actually, what's the context in there? We kind of look at these things and hold them up as this really almost biblical text that is kind of guiding us in the ways that we do things. And actually, even kind of here on the scrum.org website, you've got someone having, you know, a discussion about team sizes. Really kind of odd. But I also kind of know, I mean, I know the Scrum Guide quite well, as I'm sure that many of you do, but any guesses into, and again, the audience participation thing's not going to work here, so I'm going to fill in for you. But what does it not mention? You think you Scrum, you kind of go, yeah, we run Scrum. So many companies out there say, yeah, we're Agile, we run Scrum. We do that, we have stand-ups, we have this, we have that. But did you know that in the Scrum, official Scrum Guide, so if you go and trained by Jeff Sutherland, who I know kind of spoke at Agile Roundabout last year and was absolutely fantastic, and I've got huge amounts of admiration for him, doesn't mention user stories once in the whole guide. Doesn't talk about user stories. Not in there. It also doesn't mention velocity or any productivity metrics for that matter. Doesn't talk about them. And yet I'm sure that many of you, either through personal experience or talking with colleagues or anything like that, will say, yeah, we run Scrum. Or you go for an interview, yeah, we run Scrum, we're Agile, we have user stories. That's part of your job spec. That's part of the thing that we have and kind of the artifacts that we have. And we talk about velocity. We care about velocity. That's what Scrum doesn't mention it. Is that a good or a bad thing? I'm not quite sure. But what it does kind of highlight is that most of the time that these guides or these official certifications, these things that we kind of look to help shape our teams and help shape the way that we work, don't necessarily have all the answers. And much like I think both Rob and Jonathan kind of alluded to, bringing in that mixed match of things that are going to help us achieve this is actually the right way to do it. And hence the kind of title of the talk. You're probably doing this right already. Spotify model, I think, is another fantastic example. And it's something that I've been fortunate enough to have hands-on experience with. I've been to a few talks by people that were Agile coaches from the very early days of Spotify. I've also met and spent time with Jimmy Janlin, who is now selling himself and doing very, very well as a consultant kind of post this. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with the Spotify model. Essentially, for those that don't know, it's an organization and management system for how we should be structured. It talks about tribes, squads, chapters, guilds, as a way of organizing people around work and functions within a company. For a lot of years, it was very much considered to be the, oh my God, Spotify is growing and scaling and it's doing wonderful and it's kind of going onto the stock exchange and people are making lots of money. We should copy them. And the Spotify model was kind of seen as one of those ways that they could do that because they published a white paper about it. But here's a lovely quote from Joachim Sünden, who was an Agile coach from 2011 to 2017 at Spotify. And he said, even at the time we wrote it, we weren't doing it. It was part of an ambition, part of approximation, people have really struggled to copy something that didn't really exist. And I find that absolutely amazing. And as I said, I've been fortunate enough to spend time with some people from Spotify, and they've said this all along. It was never intended to be something that people should copy. It was meant to be something to attract talent, and it was meant to be something to kind of let some light into what was going on inside the company and kind of expose some of that. And yet there are people out there that will sell you the Spotify model. And it didn't take too much time to find kind of training institutes, and I'm sure there's kind of many more consultants out there, and thankfully it's drifted off the past kind of couple of years. But there were people out there that will sell you the Spotify model. Yet you have people from Spotify, some of which probably were quite instrumental in creating the model in the first place, telling you that it's not something that you should do. And there are consultants out there that will sell you it. I think definitely in the wrong job for me, because I'm sure they've made a shit ton of money doing it. But the two things that are, again, kind of the two examples I'll give you is, you've got this kind of Scrum Master job roles that are coming about. The Scrum Guide saying not necessarily the same thing, and I realize that there's a bit of interpretation in there, but kind of different things in there. And then you have two very clear examples of something that sometimes get bundled together, like Scrum, user stories, velocity. Not the same. Doesn't actually. It's not part of it. Spotify model. People look to it as a thing that they should be aspiring to, trying to achieve, trying to perfect. Not really a thing. Not something that people should be doing. So probably why, and kind of one of the things about this is I want to, back to my original point about why I want to push this point to all of you is I'm sure that for a lot of you, you're probably doing this right already. You are successful people in what you are doing. You're, doing very well. You're kind of helping your teams achieve things. But there's still that kind of strive. And I see this in a lot of people. I've interviewed dozens of people over the past month as my team is growing. And you kind of meet people that talk about trying to perfect that process, trying to perfect, that methodology or framework that they've been trying to achieve, and really forget the essence of what this is all about in the first place. It's about being contextual and agnostic, I think. But actually, none of this matters for a second, right? Because even me talking about all of this and preaching about how Spotify isn't right and Scrum isn't right is feeding into all of that. I'm talking about how Spotify is a thing and not a thing, and Scrum is a thing and not a thing. And I'm actually kind of feeding into that because I'm not emphasizing what's important in the first place. So let's think about this. Are you helping your customers? Is your team delivering? Again, the audience participation thing, I should have thought about this a lot more before I wrote this. But I'm sure if I was to ask every single one of you face to face and say, are you helping your customers? Is your team delivering? I'm fairly sure all of you would say yes. Because in some capacity, you are helping make that happen. And in some capacity, you're achieving that. Whether it's fantastic or you kind of give yourself an 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 of how you're doing that, different thing. But are you helping your customers? Probably. Great, wonderful. Is your team delivering? Yes, it is. We are delivering something. Could we be better? Absolutely. But are we delivering? Yes, we are. Are you providing value? And I think, again, kind of both my compatriots in kind of presenting today, talking about that value. Is your business working? Are you hitting those, KPIs, OKRs, kind of whatever it is? Like, are you working towards that? Yes, probably. In which case, why do we kind of get so wrapped up as kind of practitioners in our craft about why we're trying to strive towards Scrum or why we're trying to strive towards these things? And that's really what I want to challenge all of you today to really think about what the essence is of what you're all actually doing. And not only that, but certainly, there's a question before about senior management. What is it that we're trying to do? Well, we're trying to provide value to customers. We're trying to make our business successful. Well, then why are we trying to hit certain methodologies or talk about Scrum in certain ways? It's about these things, and you can achieve that in a million different ways. The State of Agile 2020, I think, is really a great report, and I think Rob kind of alluded to some of these. It's been going for about 14 years now, and the 2020 report came out earlier this year. It talks about lots of different things, but one of the things it talks about is Agile adoption, some of the reasons behind that. And to give you all an idea, this isn't just kind of a small sample size. It's about 40,000 Agile executives and practitioners, across the globe. primarily Europe and North America, but also increasingly in Asia and APAC. But I really love this metric because it's how success is measured with agile projects. Business value delivered, customer user satisfaction. 46 and 45% of people responded, said that was the thing that they were using to measure success at projects. It's amazing. But third on the list, unfortunately, is velocity. And who gives a shit about velocity? Like, really? It's a great metric to help like drive your teams and maybe kind of help them understand their work a bit more. But the essence of it, business value delivered, customer user satisfaction. And that's how we should think about these things. It should get us away from the idea that we have to follow Scrum or Scrum says or Spotify do this and we should follow Spotify because they've had success. What's useful for us? What's the context for us? And how can we be agnostic in our approach to best achieve that? So let's do something else. As a group, as agile practitioners, let's do something else because it's never going to be perfect. And I think that, and I know that I personally suffer from this quite a lot, is you kind of look for those absolutely perfect processes. Oh, I've got this idea in my head and I've built out a lovely kind of board and flow chart and it's going to look like this and I'm going to have all these artifacts and things that's going to happen. And then 2 weeks in, it doesn't work or something has to change or something kind of goes awry. It will never be perfect. But what actually is the point of you doing it in the first place? It's to achieve that customer value, it's to achieve that business value, it's to please your customers, it's to make a difference to those things that you're going to do that's going to outline your kind of business's success. One of the things, and I've used this a couple of times, excuse me for opening another beer because people may have probably heard about Kaizen. It's the idea of continuous improvement, but I really love this and I can't remember where I found it from, but I've kept it on my desktop as kind of a quick referral. But it's the idea of making the rule follow the rule and improving the rule. And I think Rob kind of referred to this as, or maybe Jonathan was talking about the Agile Manifesto. And actually, if you look in there is, and the same with Scrum. It's not about what they say; it's about what they don't say. That flexibility that you have, that autonomy that you have, that context that you should try and follow. About what it is you're trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve that and how you should continually adapt and innovate on the techniques and frameworks that you have. And look, not all of us are going to be lucky and fortunate enough to come up with the next Spotify model, for as much as I kind of shit in it, or found a new methodology and have a huge industry behind it like Scrum and the certifications that kind of go with it. And let me tell you, that is a multi-million-dollar industry. But certainly for our context, and we know this better than most people because we're the ones working in it, what works for us? What works for our customers? How best do we tie those kind of two things together? And actually, I think that the idea of taking something, following it, improving it, that's something that we should really kind of learn from. So I want to kind of leave you with a kind of a few things that I think are really tangible. I kind of personally like talks that are always very tangible towards the end. So I want to kind of leave you with these thoughts. If there was ever a screenshot that you're going to take, this is it. Challenge. I want you to all go away and I want you to make sure that you challenge the people around you. So when someone defines Agile as a tool or a process or a framework or uses the phrase, oh, well, Scrum says, or I read this article that told me this, that, and the other, I want you to challenge it. I want you to make sure that you ask the question, is that right for us? Is that right for our customers? Is that going to be the best way that we're able to do something? I want you to learn. I want you to keep attending meetups, obviously. I want you to read books, watch videos, take courses, go to conferences. I never want you to stop as Agile practitioners about how you can learn, how you can grow, how you can keep innovating yourselves. I want you to experiment. I want you to try new things. I want you to innovate, and I really know why one thing is better than the other. One thing that I got challenged on quite recently, and I thought this was, it kind of certainly shook my view, was why can't we estimate in time rather than estimating in story points? And I was shocked. I was like, fuck, like, no way. You kind of like, time is evil. It's horrible. My experience tells me this. But actually, if they were to experiment and one was better than the other, like, what if I'm wrong? The kind of that experimentation and having, proof is in the pudding, I think is very valid. But having the data kind of behind it and trying different techniques, to figure out what works for you in the context of your team, in the context of your customers, in the context of what you're trying to achieve. Don't kind of fit, one size doesn't fit all, certainly. Keep an open mind. You may have your favorites, but being open to other ways of doing things, I think, is incredibly important. Even in the State of Agile kind of report, it talks about how Safe and Scrum is kind of 80 to 85% of the overall respondents' preferred methodology. That means that somewhere out there's 85% of those 40,000 people are doing Scrum. Probably not quite how the original book was intended or how it kind of lays it out, because I'm sure they're using lots of other methodologies. But it means that they're identifying as Scrum. But what if there's something better? What if there's a tweak in there that they have made and they're not kind of calling it out because they're too afraid of being, not fitting that checkbox on the kind of report? Really interesting. So keep an open mind, think about the different things that are going on, think about the opportunities that you have. Be agnostic. I think this is probably the most important one for all this, is Agile as a culture and a philosophy. And it's ultimately a set of values. If you think about the original Agile manifesto, it is a series of values. It doesn't talk about any specific methodology. And that ultimately implies that there are lots of different ways of being able to do it. And it should be about the context that you're in. There are lots of ways to achieve the things that you're trying to achieve. Don't be limited by a single methodology or more. And lastly, and probably equally as important as the last one, think about the context. What does your team need? What does your company need? But most importantly, what does your customer need, and how best can you achieve that? Something that it took me quite a few years after discovering, Agile and Scrum and Kanban and Lean and all the other kind of wonderful methodologies that we're all here kind of around about. Was there is a place for waterfall. There are projects that waterfall is more suited to. And actually, there are things that I can take from waterfall and Scrum and Agile and merge them all together and find a really incredible way of doing things. But I didn't think about the context for quite a few years. I was like, oh no, I can't use that. It's old, it's horrible, it's nasty. Like, we don't do that anymore, we're Agile. But it's kind of feeding into that thing of perception rather than about need and about context. So think about your context. What is going to change between now and in 6 months' time? In 6 months' time, you shouldn't be doing the same thing anymore. It should be different, because you're certainly not working on the same thing. Your customers have evolved and changed, and their needs have changed. Why haven't you changed? And lastly, I want you all to think about your skills as very much as a toolbox. How do you build it and how do you use it? One of the analogies that I love to use kind of on people that are kind of part of my team is, imagine you've got a toolbox, you've got wrenches, you've got hammers, kind of vis-a-vis, it's Lean, Scrum, Agile, Waterfall, kind of whatever it is. How do you use them and how do you gain that experience? And how do you keep filling your toolbox? Because the context is always going to change. Change is always going to come. So how can you always kind of keep that toolbox full? How can you try new things and how can you keep evolving that? Think about your skill set very much as a toolbox and how you keep building it. Thank you very much. So I think that's me 2 beers in. So I'll stop talking now and pass over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Nick. You definitely promoted some healthy discussions in the chat. I was reading through. So, by the way, other panelists, if you want to jump in at any point and ask some questions, but we have a question from Hamid. Do you think Agile is still relevant in the age of Scrum?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Agile, if you imagine in your head kind of like layers, Agile is at the very bottom. It's that philosophy, values, the frameworks that layer on top are the ways that you achieve that. And I think that bedrock of Agile, customer first, thinking about value, and even back to that original quote about, flaccid Scrum, the emphasis in there is not about necessarily the process and doing the process wrong, although I'm sure it was definitely a way of, ensuring that there was plenty of people that signed up to Scrum training courses. But the emphasis in there is about the customer, the value that you delivered, the iterations that you delivered, the experimentation you delivered. So I think Agile at the core of it is that's what it's representing. So yeah, I really do.
Cool. Just before we wrap up, just want to make sure no more questions. Do any of the panelists have any questions they'd like to ask Nick?
can throw one question out there for you, Nick, is, with a lot of those types of practices that are out there, like, for example, story points, I often, with a lot of organizations, run into where many organizations want to start codifying these things like story points or Scrum or certain things as a matter of corporate policy to say, oh, let's standardize a story point, or let's say all teams must have a daily stand up, or things like that. How, in your experience, have you kind of coached organizations away from codifying those practices as a matter of corporate policy?
That's a very good question. It's something that comes up a lot, actually. Like, what's minimum? And when you kind of build these teams, and I'm fortunate enough to work at a company that is in a very strong arena of growth at the moment. So when we're kind of building new teams and we're trying to build those things out, like, what is minimum?
Yeah.
You think about, well, is that user stories? Is that this? Is it that? And like, how do we kind of codify some of those things? But it's very much, I think, the intention and the motivation behind it. Like, is it a bedrock and a foundation to evolve from? Is that a place to kind of get started from? And I think it's about that kind of culture and motivation around it that kind of hinges off of that. So in some companies that I've worked in the past, and certainly as we are now, we think about what's the minimum that you start from, and then how do we evolve from that? And I think that, ultimately at the core of it all is what's going to work for the customer. Well, we know these kind of things work because that's the cadence and scale and kind of so on. But ultimately it's about that customer, and forcing that contextual change really helps to shake off that being kind of stuck on things. So I think in summary, it's about what's your minimum, what kind of works, what doesn't work. Does that fit into your, cadence, rhythm, governance, kind of pick your poison for language for the company? How do you make decisions, for example? But then after that, I think it's about how do you get the leg up for teams? How do you get them started? And then post that, how do you keep the culture of innovation and culture of change, and thinking about context? How do you kind of put that into all the teams?
So it's almost like, to kind of have a play on the term, a minimum viable process, as it were.
Absolutely. It's interesting because Joachim, who I've met before, talks about the idea of minimum viable agile, or minimum viable process.
Yeah.
And I think, if we were to be really honest with ourselves for a second, there is minimums. The idea of autonomy, I think, is a really interesting one, because, a lot of teams and a lot of people aren't set up to be autonomous. They're not capable of doing it. So how about we give them a helping hand and say, look, here's where you start from, and then you evolve from there, because you'll understand the context a lot more. I totally believe in the idea of kind of a minimum agile and a minimum process, certainly.